Whatever happened to the pepper spray plan? Whatever happened to the pepper spray plan and the pepper spray legislation? Well, let's see if we could find that out, and let's see if we could follow that story and see what are the ramifications of all of this pepper spray legislation, and where can we see it going, and what benefit can we actually get from it. There's a lot of conversation going on around it now as some of the legislation was brought forward. There's debate going on right now in the Senate, and the debate is getting quite heated. Well, at least it seems to be getting quite lively, and with many senators pointing out that the debate over the pepper spray is misguided and misshaped, in that we're talking about weapons and defense while it's really a matter of gendered violence. And okay, there's a point there, and let's see what they're saying about it. Somewhere around the ending of last month, the opposition leader and the opposition party made a bit of noise asking where exactly is this legislation, because this was a point that the opposition seemed to latch on to quite a bit. They were speaking strongly about the pepper spray legislation and finding legislation and finding ways to allow for people and victims of abuse in our society to be able to defend themselves. So on Monday, bear in mind this is over a month ago, on Monday, opposition leader Kamala Persad-Bissessar said there was still no legislation to enact pepper spray use, which was promised by the government following the murder of Arima law clerk Andrea Barrett in January. I guess most of us in Trinidad will remember that story. And if you don't, it was the tragic story of a kidnapping and eventual murder of a young lady in her 20s in the Arima district. It kicked off a few weeks, I believe it was weeks, yes, of vigils and protests and many people clamoring for things to be done to protect our girls and women, and that too much violence was happening in our society that was geared towards women and girls. And this debate always tends to get testy to a certain extent because there's a bit of politicization behind the gendered issues, and many people tend to get into their own groups and their own tribes and their own sides when these issues are brought up. And also how some of these issues are brought up tends to create sometimes more division than unity in looking for a good perspective on it. The Attorney General, Mr. Al-Rawi, responded to them and he said, "I would like Mrs. Persad-Bissessar, and in particular young Member of Parliament Saddam Hussein, to develop a conscience and to recognize that the protection of women in the gender context in this particular issue is by far more than pepper spray," he said. And this is a sentiment that is echoed continuously, that this legislation is the true measure to really getting a hold of this issue. Al-Rawi criticized the opposition, saying they had consistently refused to support the mechanisms to prevent monsters from walking amongst the population. He said this included the collapse of the bail legislation, the interception of communication amendments, and refusing to allow witness anonymity. These are several bills that didn't get the opposition support. The opposition would say that these bills were incomplete and they were worried about loopholes and some of them violating the rights of our citizens, while the government would say that the opposition was just playing politics and that these bills would have been able to tackle some of the issues that we are currently facing, and that these bills may have been, if not obviously not the complete answer, but work towards being part of the answer for some of the problems that we are facing. And true to his word, about a week ago, we saw that the Attorney General did lay the pepper spray legislation in the Senate. Long-awaited legislation for pepper spray use will be debated in the Senate next Tuesday. And apart from applicants over 18, certain categories of law enforcement will also be allowed to use it in their duties. Plus, there will be huge fines along with jail terms for misuse of the non-lethal weapon. The bill being introduced is the culmination of the government's work on non-lethal weapons following public pressure after the murders of women, including Ashanti Riley and Andrea Barrett, which prompted calls for use of pepper spray, tasers, or other non-lethal weapons. Now, I agree with these things, and I am of the solemn belief that people have a right to defend themselves, and I think personally that if criminals have access to weapons, we should be able to access the same weapons that the criminals have access to. If a government wants us to not have weapons, wants the population to not have weapons, then they have to be very good at preventing weapons from being in the criminals' hands. Because if you're preventing weapons from being in the law-abiding citizens' hands, and that's what you do when you make a law against weapons, you only prevent it from being in law-abiding citizens' hands, then that means that the criminals would have these weapons, unless your crime prevention agency and your crime prevention measures are enough to ensure that criminals don't have them at all. And then there will always be this power imbalance where criminals have more power than the citizenry, and that doesn't create for peaceful living, as we can tell in Trinidad. Some of this legislation came as reaction to the murders and the kidnapping of these young ladies, which was very tragic and which no one wants to see happen again. But I am not sure that pepper spray or tasers would have prevented either of these two scenarios. And maybe it can prevent some scenarios, and I have no doubt that it may actually help in some situations. But people are right. This legislation obviously would not necessarily help in this kind of violence against the young women in our society. And even phrasing it just as violence against the young women can possibly obscure some of the solutions and some of the underlying problems. I think our society is suffering from criminality and violence on a whole. And what happens is that young women, and women in general, there is a physical imbalance. And if there's a physical imbalance, what happens with criminals? Criminals tend to use their advantages for their advantage. So if you're not home, if you're weaker, if you're not as well armed as a criminal, if they out-arm you, in other words, they have stronger weaponry than you do, then they will use that imbalance to take what you have. And that's basically what goes on in gendered violence too. Many men can use some of their physical advantages over some women for their advantage, to take advantage of them and take what they want. So the modern world, and in particular the Western world, we phrase a lot of this violence as gendered violence. But really and truly, it's violence on a whole. It's a problem with violence and in the entire sense of it. And if we can reduce all around violence, of course we reduce gendered violence also. Men are the victims of violent crime more so than women in our societies. One of the problems with that though is that men are also the perpetrators of the violent crime more, but that doesn't change the fact that the men are also the victims. So sometimes overly focusing on one group can make it seem like you're discounting the fact that men are the majority of victims of these same violent crimes also. Much like firearms, people will have to apply to the Commissioner of Police or an authorized officer for a permit to import, export, divert, sell, manufacture, produce, or distribute pepper spray. According to the proposal, those who wish to purchase, acquire, or have it in their possession will apply for a pepper spray permit. Both types of permits will be granted to people over the age of 18. In the case of those 16 and over, the parent, guardian, or person with responsibility for the child must give written permission for the child to be in possession of pepper spray. For business people, a license to import, produce, or manufacture pepper spray will cost $50 and be for 5 years. For holders, a license to purchase, acquire, or have pepper spray will cost the same and be for 3 years. Permits won't be granted to people whom the commissioner or officer has reason to believe to be of intemperate habits or unsound mind, or to be for any reason unfit to be entrusted with pepper spray. This sounds a lot to me like gun license 2.0, and they just rephrased the gun into pepper spray, and it's about the same rules, because in order to use this you need to apply to get it and go through some bureaucratic processes. I hope for the sake of everyone that these bureaucratic processes, when you go to apply, that it doesn't take a year and that people can be able to access these things quickly. Because oftentimes when someone is looking to get something for their own safety and for their own self-protection and self-defense, there may be some sense of urgency to it. It should go without saying that it's proposed that it's only to be used as self-defense. And well, I guess that's everything. The only way we are really allowed to use any type of violence, any type of harmful interaction to another human being is out of self-defense. You are not going to take your pepper spray and go and try to rub someone with it. That would be a crime, obviously. People who beat the government to it and already acquired their pepper spray, which would have been illegal before, but there were ways around it. So people like that who already had their pepper spray, current owners of pepper spray, have 6 months to get the permit, and the Attorney General said he's mindful that they may have to extend that time, and that would be the intention, possibly. The proposal is that the spray may be sold in some pharmacies and other places and work sort of like an over-the-counter prescription business where a record is kept of all who have purchased it and all who are holders of the pepper spray at the moment. Those prohibited from getting permits will be people who have been charged as well as convicted on firearms issues and on bail matters from burglaries to sex offenses. The court will decide on persons involved in domestic violence issues. Al-Rawi said domestic violence matters were he say, she say issues with very dangerous consequences. The sad irony of all of that is that domestic matters and domestic abuse cases may be the exact place where the self-defense of a pepper spray or of these non-lethal weapons may come in most handy. And these are the exact cases that will be very difficult to try, because until there's actual obvious evidence of physical harm being done in some of these domestic violence cases, as the Attorney General pointed out, a lot of domestic violence cases end up as just he said, she said, and how is someone to take the side of one or the other? So if a lady in a domestic violence case came up and said her partner, who is a man, is abusive towards her, should the court just take her word on it, and now he is unable to access something that we see as a citizen you have the right to access for self-defense? Or what if it happens in the reverse, and that is possible? If a man in a relationship accuses a lady in a relationship of abuse, does the court take his word on it that she is an abuser and refuses her self-defense provision of some non-lethal weapon? But the reality also is that some of these accusations may be correct, and not maybe, some of these accusations obviously are correct. And a spouse or partner may be accusing someone and attempting to get the authorities to keep a further weapon out of their hand, and the authorities would have their hands tied because now they can't decide on such a matter. And that's one of the sad realities of these matters also. And it just makes it all the more complex. Independent Senator Anthony Vieira, however, said he didn't like the amendment. He felt it was disingenuous, condescending to women, and disproportionate. If it was for self-defense, he felt it so convoluted and bureaucratic, it may be beyond the reach of women who need it. And that's a point that I was making before. If this is meant for self-defense, all the long red tape and bureaucracy in order to get this thing that is meant for self-defense. Some of the women who may be in the most unfortunate circumstances and maybe needing this self-defense the most may not be able to go through all of this process. They may be trying to sneak somewhere and just be able to buy this pepper spray on a moment's notice. They can't go and apply to the police station and get their name taken down in an official record book, and etc. and etc. But the balance to this also is then, what do we do in the contrary? Do we just free up these non-lethal weapons to anyone to be able to access them? He said unless women have the time, money, and resources to deal with the bureaucratic requirements to access, they would not get the things they desperately need. Al-Rawi said the process wasn't bureaucratic and wasn't like a firearm license application. Vieira said it was possible to weaponize household products from insecticide to gasoline, and it might be easier to get guns, cutlasses, or knives. He said pepper spray should be as easy to acquire, and that's a point. And to me, that's always been one of the points when I think about making weapons illegal. And even as far as guns, okay, if guns are illegal because they are dangerous when it comes to interpersonal conflicts, we do not want the power in someone's hand to be able to just point something, pull a trigger, and end someone else's life. We don't like that power in another person's hand. So that's why guns are illegal. But if we do that, and then all we are doing is stopping law-abiding citizens from getting the guns, then this isn't making the country any safer. In fact, I think it may be making the country more dangerous. I would trust it more if I knew all of my neighbors who are upstanding members of society were armed. I actually don't mind that thought. Even if all of them had pepper spray, if every woman I meet in the street has pepper spray, that's not really a worry for me. Yes, there are some crazy people out there. Yes, there are some crazy women out there, but I have never met a random woman in the street who ran up to me and tried to slap me. And I think the chances of some random person just randomly trying to pepper spray you may be likewise. And either way, regardless of how someone accesses the pepper spray, whatever they do with it, the actions still are within the bounds of laws. Whether you get the pepper spray legally or illegally, whether you have to go through a long process and get it over the counter or prescription, or make it yourself and mash some pepper and mix it with some other stuff, because I've heard that there are some homemade recipes for pepper spray that work very effectively also. But regardless of how you acquire it, if you take that and commit assault, it would still be assault. It would still be assault. So sometimes the extra long process in acquiring this thing because it's called a weapon seems counterproductive and illogical to me, but that's to me. He wasn't the only senator to be critical of the bill. The opposition Senator Jayanti Lakshmi also got into it. She was asking who the AG consulted over this bill, and she said it took a public outcry for government to bring the legislation to Parliament, which is true, and I am not sure that public outcries necessarily make the best bills, and it could sound strange that a government is meant to listen to the people and the public, and that is true, but sometimes in the heat of a moment, just what the public outcry is may not necessarily be the best solution for a situation, and that should be kept in mind also. Not saying that this bill isn't good, but just a knee-jerk, a trigger reaction for public outcry doesn't always make for the best legislation and the best laws. Senator Lakshmi Dayal said non-lethal weapons can address rape culture. They can assist in the apprehension of an offender, give a potential victim a fighting chance, and allow people to protect themselves, she said. Now, I think she just heard a buzz term there, rape culture, and used it, because I don't think pepper sprays work for helping what rape culture is. At least what rape culture is said to be is a culture in a society, a culture all around in a society that feeds into a patriarchal mindset, a male supremacist basically mindset that allows for the excusing and societal acceptance of behaviors and tendencies that lead towards abuse and crimes such as rape. So rape culture isn't really tackled with pepper spray. If you are to believe that there is rape culture in Trinidad, the way that it is tackled is through societal measures, and that's a whole other conversation. And I think she may be misspeaking when she references rape culture in bringing up with this pepper spray argument. I don't think that's relevant to pepper spray. Pepper spray is about self-defense. And again, that brings up some of the questions that some people have with the entire thing, where is it a gender debate and a debate on ending violence towards women and girls? Or is it a debate on self-defense and citizens on a whole our rights to protect ourselves and use whatever weapons we may be able to acquire in the protection of ourselves? So it's not necessarily, because I don't think the legislation has a particular referencing to only girls and women being able to access these weapons, these non-lethal weapons to be more specific. So I'm not sure exactly how someone may be able to get from this a fully gender-based legislation, and I think that may be some of the problems that they have with it. As Senator Richards puts forward, private motion that is more than a pepper spray debate. Independent Senator Paul Richards has put forward a private member's motion for the government to critically assess the deficiencies in the current systems to deal with the incidences of violent crimes against women and girls. He urged that it was not a pepper spray debate, but one that aims to find solutions and not playing the blame game or finger pointing. And I love the idea of that. A senator of ours, someone that we are paying as a country, bringing forth legislation, or not legislation rather, but bringing forth a motion to be able to debate something to try and get some solutions. And as a society, it's our responsibility to care for those more advantaged. That's why we care more for children. We're supposed to care more for children and the elderly and those in positions of disadvantage and misfortune. He said a safe and reliable public transport system is also crucial, alluding to the fact that many recent incidents of violence against women involved PH taxis. He said the fact that millions are spent on the PTSC, which is the Public Transport Service Commission, annually, but only covers 3 to 5% of the traveling public, is atrocious, and I fully agree. That is atrocious, and I think this point needs to be hammered home a little more, and there may be some solutions that can be found there, because we are already paying for a transport system with many buses. I don't know right now the exact number of buses, at least the exact number of working buses. I'm sure the number of working buses is much smaller than the number of buses that we are paying for currently, but we do have quite a few buses on the road. And when you look around, and we have some rural buses now working in some more rural areas and some areas that may have been more forgotten in times gone before. And when you look at these buses and what they're doing, most of the times, 90% of the times, you watch them and the only passenger they have is the air condition blowing alongside the driver inside of the bus. And a lot of times it's not just that people don't want to use these buses, because these buses aren't bad. I've traveled in these buses before, and if anyone else has traveled in them, you would also know that these buses aren't horrible. They make for a pretty comfortable ride. You're high up, the seats are plush, the AC is cold usually once the bus is functioning well. So if we're looking to keep a lot of the public safe, the public transport system that we are already paying for and that is already in works seems like a good way to start. But how do we make it such a way that citizens are interested in using this service now? Because as it stands, most citizens have given up on it, and I think a lot of the reason many people have given up on it is because it is unreliable. In the end, is pepper spray really the solution? I doubt it. Is it going to save some lives? I hope so. How many lives it's going to save? I don't think anyone knows. So all we can have is hope. And I don't really see the point of trying to tie up this legislation in so much bureaucracy that makes it difficult for people to access it, because I really don't think that bandits are going to be coming out here leaving their guns to try and get pepper spray to rob us. What do you think? See you in the next video.